When you think about the entirety of the MMORPG genre and the games that really shaped it, what games come to mind? Not just the games that shaped it for you, but the ones that really brought the genre to where it is today, for good or ill. That is what we're going to be talking about today, and I am 100% ready for the hate comments because I left out your favorite MMORPG. And I can tell you right now, I know at least one that I know people will get upset about, so I'm just preparing myself. So let's get right into it so you can go ahead and start drafting your comments right down below about why Wizard 101 is the most impactful MMO of our generation, followed closely by New World. The first one we have to talk about is, of course, Ultima Online. Ultima Online was not the first MMORPG, technically, but it was one of the first, and it ushered in a new era of MMOs, peaking at over 100,000 players and defining what MMORPGs could be, especially as a sandbox. It inspired MMOs that came after it in different branching patterns, whether it was the cutthroat PvP, its deep crafting systems, its sandbox exploration and skill system, intense death penalties, housing and decorating, dungeons, even animal taming. Ultima Online showed what could be done to create a world that truly was a living and breathing place, though one could argue it struggled under the weight of its lack of direction. Eventually, due to players leaving the game, Ultima Online made a change to separate PvP and PvE. Lack of housing space meant housing became a premium, with only preset housing spots still available, taking away parts of the game that were very meaningful. But the game still continues on to this day, both as an official title under Broadsword as well as in emulator servers like UO Outlands, which are completely custom. It's even getting an entirely new server type called New Legacy on October 15th, 2024, that brings in more of a driving narrative and seasonal content. Ultima Online will always be one of the most impactful MMORPGs, influencing design in many MMOs over the decades like Star Wars Galaxies, ArcAge, Albion Online, Fractured Online, Ashes of Creation, Mortal Online, Shadowbane, and many, many more. It is a game that had so many different elements to it, so many things that could be plucked and pulled, that it's sometimes hard to see the direct thread from where it came from in these MMOs. Whether it's the sandbox building, the skill trees, the PvP, the PvE, how they treat different parts of their game, Ultima Online will always stand out as one of the most influential MMOs, not just because of how long it has continued to exist and how many players it has impacted, but also how it has influenced the design of MMOs for years. But the next game on the list may have had an even more impactful and enduring legacy than Ultima Online, and that is EverQuest. If Ultima Online was the archetype for the open world exploration sandbox MMO, it still lacked one key element outside of roving PvP bands: group play. Enter EverQuest, launching 2 years after Ultima Online in 1999. EverQuest was the pioneer MMO for group play and class roles. It leaned heavily on class interdependence with 4 primary roles: tank, DPS, healer, and control or CC. The elements of Dungeons & Dragons right down to those class roles were apparent in every part of EverQuest design, from their deep shared dungeons to their massive raid bosses, from dragons to gods to aliens. EverQuest took the baton from Ultima Online and ran with it, peaking at nearly 500,000 players back when MMOs were even more niche than they are today. It was also one of the first MMOs to create its own sequel, EverQuest II, as well as one of the first console MMO spin-offs in EverQuest Online Adventure. decades before an MMO like New World would make the jump to console as well. All the way back on the PlayStation 2, believe it or not. So many, just so many polygons. It was a different time. EverQuest, the original title though, has been going for 25 years at this point, with over 30 expansions to its name, creating an incredibly sprawling world of PvE content. It was also, I believe, the first fully 3D MMORPG, and unlike Ultima Online, it offered a variety of playable races to choose from halflings to ogres, something many MMOs today, even bright shiny AAA titles, struggle with. EverQuest was the MMO that was so popular it shut down part of San Diego's power grid. It defined MMOs, and were it not for another MMO on this list, may have gone down as the most impactful MMO ever. But before we get to that elephant in the room, the giant MMO that you know that I'm going to have on this list, we have to talk about one that is more oft forgotten. One that actually pioneered the grind, in a sense. Lineage II from NCSoft was one of the largest MMOs ever made. It launched in 2003, 4 years after EverQuest, and reported over 14 million unique users, which might not sound like a ton today, but back then, for the MMORPG genre, that is a huge number. Of the games on this list, Lineage II is the one I played the absolute least, though I did play it. It's one of those games that really leaned into the grind aspect, even more so than EverQuest or Ultima Online, each of which had their own grind, but it also made waves following the success of its predecessor, Lineage. Its grindy focus can potentially be linked to future games like Black Desert Online or even Final Fantasy XI, but really, I think the game deserves to be on this list largely just due to its size and reception. In an era of MMOs where they were still hanging around a few 100,000 players, Lineage II captivated a tremendous audience, one it has carried over several sequels, though those have mostly been mobile titles. One has to wonder if with all of the success that Lineage and Lineage II had, what would have happened if Throne and Liberty had remained a direct sequel to Lineage as it really was supposed to be? How would that have impacted the current MMO landscape versus what we got with Throne and Liberty? It may end up being one of those questions that becomes the biggest what if in MMORPGs, because there's so many things that Throne and Liberty abandoned from the original Lineage game, from the different playable races to the grind. Over 12 years of development, it just begs the question, what could it have been? What would it have been if it had tapped into that built-in fan base of Lineage and Lineage II? One of the most impactful MMOs for at least a decade, especially in its home market. Our next game also has a pseudo sequel that really didn't live up to expectations, and that's Dark Age of Camelot. And if you're sitting there thinking, hey, there was no sequel to Dark Age of Camelot, there's two technically. One's a different game, and the other one is in limbo at the moment. You've got Warhammer Online, and you've got Camelot Unchained. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about DAOC. If Ultima Online introduced PvP to MMORPGs, DAOC refined it into a team-based game. To this day, DAOC is talked about as the pinnacle of PvP, largely due to the realm versus realm setup, something that has been emulated by one of the largest MMOs today, Elder Scrolls Online, who also utilizes the 3-team structure in their massive PvP battles to help balance it out a little bit. Now obviously this doesn't work out perfectly, as there will be occasions where two factions work together against a third, but it makes it more difficult to get the massive imbalances seen in other binary PvP games like World of Warcraft or even Warhammer Online. Warhammer Online, which was made by the creators of DAOC, but eschewed the 3 realms for 2, Order and Chaos. Dark Age of Camelot did a lot of things well, but their approach to PvP stands above as it's the most consequential addition to the MMORPG landscape, even if it wasn't always replicated by future games as it should have been. If you just think about some of the games that came after Dark Age of Camelot that did lean into PvP, and think how would a third faction have changed the game, it really start to go down a long wormhole of, wow, this actually would have been really freaking cool, including perhaps our next game, although it succeeded regardless.
4 years have passed since the mortal races banded together and stood united against the might of the Burning Legion. Though Azeroth was saved, the tenuous pact between the Horde and the Alliance has all but evaporated. The drums of war thunder once again.
The most self-explanatory game on this list, and the one that is probably the most consequential MMO, whether we want to say it or not. The one that a list like this would be incomplete without, laughable even, fake, because with this game, the entire trajectory of the MMORPG genre changed forever. World of Warcraft. It was the MMO that ignited the burning embers into a raging fire, pushing MMOs in the West from the hundreds of thousands to the millions of players, and in so doing, opening up the genre to untold numbers of new players that never would have considered it before. It broke MMOs into the mainstream with primetime commercials, South Park episodes, and even its own movie. A movie that honestly, it's actually pretty good. It's worth going to watch. It's one of those movies that gets better the farther you get from release. World of Warcraft forever changed the genre. It introduced a new way to progress, a more streamlined approach that drifted away from the more sandbox games of the past 7 years or so before. In Ultima Online, you went anywhere, you gained skills how you wanted, and there were no levels. In EverQuest, you killed NPCs for experience and quests, and despite the name, the quests were reserved for epic items or faction grinding. In Star Wars Galaxies, the equivalent of quests, missions, were just for gaining credits to buy your home, instruments, or that awesome new sniper rifle. World of Warcraft upended it all with the driving quest lines that provided the bulk of your experience gain, streamlining that process around creating the Quest Hub MMO. The exclamation point marker so many people have known for in MMOs came from WoW, as did the instancing of dungeons. But perhaps even more enduring and damning is the legacy of WoW that followed, as MMO companies pivoted, even some that had come before, like Mythic and Sony, with DAOC and EQ, which tried to copy WoW's success by taking over its formula, with Warhammer Online and EverQuest 2. Further games like Runes of Magic were bold in their copying of WoW, and thus began the era of the WoW clone. Countless MMOs, many we have now long forgotten, that took WoW's Quest Hub formula and failed to execute it well enough, at least until our next game came around. Final Fantasy XIV has to be the MMO to round out this list for 2 distinct reasons. First, it is now the largest MMO post-WoW that hasn't really strayed too far from what WoW did. The hallmarks between the 2 games are very apparent. There's more similarity than difference, though Final Fantasy XIV made one distinct pivot. Story. personal story. While WoW had questlines and world stories, Final Fantasy XIV leaned on its history of RPGs and brought an RPG storyline directly focused on the character into the MMORPG genre. You became the Chosen One, among millions of other chosen ones, but still you were the chosen one. But this wasn't wholly Final Fantasy XIV's innovation. Other MMOs, all kind of around the same time frame, began to experiment with it, and even WoW themselves have turned closer to this in recent expansions. But perhaps the more consequential and enduring legacy of Final XIV will always be its biggest failure. Final Fantasy XIV would probably be on this list purely for this second reason, because it is the largest example of an MMORPG completely and utterly failing, and then being reborn. When Final Fantasy XIV first launched, it was met with a cold reception. It was beautiful to be sure, but it chugged on many PCs. I remember booting it up and being absolutely amazed by the graphics and utterly underwhelmed by the gameplay. Final Fantasy XIV was so bad, it actually killed itself off. Final Fantasy XIV went back to the drawing board for years, having begun development in 2004 and releasing in 2010 to near universal negative reception. Quite simply, people hated it. But rather than keep stringing the game along, trying to keep it alive while reworking it, Square pulled the game in 2011 and began their multi-year rework, changing the game engine and mostly rebuilding it from scratch, with major changes to battle systems, dungeons, storylines, and so much more. The end result? Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, the now critically acclaimed and beloved MMORPG that has, if even just briefly, held the crown of the largest MMO. It stands head and shoulders above other failures and success stories in the MMORPG genre, going from such low depths to such high highs, by being willing to tear down the entire MMO that they'd made to remake something players wanted. And it's a game that is now celebrating a 10-year anniversary. Technically at least. Maybe a little bit longer than 10 years. But perhaps even more interesting than all that, with all this, they added lore reasons as explanations for what happened in the real world. The game world was reborn in a literal lore sense. Version 1.0 of the game takes place in the end of the 6th Astral Era, while A Realm Reborn begins in the 7th Umbral Era. The failure of the game is represented as a calamity. It is in-game lore with events of A Realm Reborn taking place in the future. What other MMO can say they wrote their own destruction into the game? Except EverQuest 2. EverQuest 2 technically did it, but that was just lore. There are lots of great MMORPGs that deserve to be on this list beyond these. It hurt to not add Star Wars Galaxies or City of Heroes, and it feels wrong not to have an MMO like Warhammer Online on here due to the introduction of the public quest system, or Star Wars or the Republic with their individual class stories, or even BDO and ESO for their action combat, not to mention RuneScape and its enduring legacy that continues to this day. In fact, you know, I probably am gonna get some shit for not including old school RuneScape on this list, given just how impactful that game has been. So I'm gonna try and do like a mulligan here. I'm gonna try and save some face a little bit, and I'm gonna do it by not doing any work myself, but directing you to someone who did. I'm gonna suggest going to check out one of the best old school RuneScape videos I've ever seen, from Idle. Not only does it go into explaining a lot of the history of RuneScape, but it also kind of explains why this game is not just so popular now, but it also goes into a lot of detail explaining not just why this game is so popular or was so popular, but why it's actually been gaining in popularity. It's a very fascinating video and a really engaging one. And he can explain it so much better than me, who never played RuneScape. And honestly, I'm not just saying that because his birthday is February 22nd. You'll know why I know that as soon as you go watch the video.